So you want to use that song clip or movie quote or meme in your podcast without getting sued? Well, fair use might be your answer, but it is not as straightforward as it might seem. So buckle up. Today we're getting into what you've got to know about fair use as a podcaster to keep your show on the right side of the law. And we'll be looking at some real life cases where fair use was put to the test. So stick around. All right, welcome back to Legit Podcast Pro, the podcast where we break down the legal and business side of podcasting so you can focus on creating without worrying about the legal stuff. I'm your host, Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer, and today's episode is all about fair use, a concept that many creators rely on, but few truly understand. So whether you're new to podcasting or a seasoned pro, understanding this stuff, fair use, is essential to keep your content legal and protect yourself from expensive lawsuits. So we're going to explore the ins and outs of this fair use defense. We're going to discuss real-world cases where fair use has been challenged, and I'll give you some practical tips to help you stay inside the legal boundaries. So first off, what is fair use? Well, it's a legal doctrine that allows for limited use of copyrighted material without having to get permission from the copyright holder. The idea behind fair use is to balance the interests of creators who want to protect their work with the public's First Amendment free speech interest in being able to use existing content for purposes like commentary or criticism, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, or research. But here's the catch. Fair use is not a clear-cut situation where we have a rule of thumb that we can rely on. It's more like a set of guidelines that require interpretation, and each case is unique. It's called ad hoc interpretation. The courts consider four main factors when they determine whether something qualifies as fair use. So here's exactly what the Fair Use section of the Copyright Act says. This is most of the language from Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 107, which is the Fair Use statute. In determining whether the use made of a work in any particular case is a fair use, the factors to be considered shall include. Note that's include, not be limited to. All right, 1, the purpose and character of the use, including whether such use is of a commercial nature or is for nonprofit educational purposes. Number 2 is the nature of the copyrighted work. And number 3 is the amount and substantiality of the portion used in relation to the copyrighted work as a whole. And the fourth factor is the effect of the use upon the potential market for or value of the copyrighted work. So let's go through that one part at a time. First off, that purpose and character of the use. This factor is looking at why and how you're using the copyrighted material. Is your use transformative? In other words, are you adding something new like commentary, criticism, or parody, or are you simply repurposing the original content? For example, if you're reviewing a movie on your podcast and you play a short clip to critique the film, well, more likely than not, that'll be considered fair use, assuming the other factors weigh out okay. On the other hand, if you play the clip just because it's cool or entertaining, less likely to be considered fair use. Here's a case in point. In the case of Campbell versus Acuff Rose Music, the Supreme Court ruled that Two Live Crew's parody of the Roy Orbison song, "Oh Pretty Woman," was fair use because it was transformative. The parody added new expression and meaning, essentially using a humorous approach to poke fun at both the original song and the artist and the environment in which that song emerged. So the parody added up to more than simply a copy or repurposing. Number 2 is the nature of the copyrighted work. This second factor considers the nature of the work that you're using. Is the original a factual thing like a news report or more of a historical account? Or is it highly creative like a song or a movie or a novel or a painting or something like that? Courts generally are more protective of creative works because they represent a higher degree of original expression. So if you use a clip from a documentary, which is very factual, versus a clip from a blockbuster movie, which is more creative, the former is more likely to be considered a fair use than the latter. Another example, in Harper and Row versus Nation Enterprises, the Supreme Court ruled against The Nation magazine when they had published excerpts from President Gerald Ford's as yet unpublished memoir. The court found that the unpublished nature of the work weighed against a finding of fair use, especially because those excerpts revealed essentially the heart of the memoir. Factor number 3 is the amount and substantiality factor. This examines how much of the copyrighted work you've used and whether the portion you've used is significant. The less you use, the more likely it is to be considered fair use. But even a small amount can be too much if it represents the essence or the heart of the work. And in Sony Corporation versus Universal Studios, the Supreme Court found that recording entire TV shows for personal, non-commercial use was fair use, mainly because the purpose wasn't competitive with the original. But if you were to take the most memorable or impactful scenes from a movie and use them in your podcast just as sort of pure entertainment, it could be argued that you're using the heart, the essence of the work, and that would possibly weigh against fair use. You see what I mean about there being no rules of thumb? Okay. The fourth factor, finally, the court considers whether your use of the copyrighted material affects the market for the original work. If your use could replace the original work or reduce its value, that's a red flag. Now, remember, notice that I didn't say whether you make money from it or not. That is not a factor that we have to consider in copyright or fair use cases. If it's a copy and it's made without permission, then the next issue is, is it fair use? And fair use doesn't care whether you made money from it. It cares whether you have essentially deprived the owner of the work from a way of making money. So it's a different side of things. Doesn't matter whether you're not making a profit, okay? So a famous example here is in the case of Authors Guild versus Google, where the Second Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that Google's use of copyrighted books to create a searchable database was fair use. Even though Google was scanning entire books, the court found that it didn't harm the market for those books because it provided only snippets of them rather than full copies. All right, so now that we've covered the 4 factors, let's talk about how fair use can apply specifically to podcasters. As a podcaster, you might be tempted to include snippets from movies, songs, TV shows, or even other podcasts in your episodes. But before you do that, you need to consider these 4 factors in determining whether your use is likely to be treated as fair use. So let's break it down with an example. Say you're hosting a podcast about pop culture and you want to include a 10-second clip from a hit song to illustrate a point. So first off, purpose and character. Are you analyzing or criticizing the song? Well, if so, then your use is more likely to be considered fair use. But if you're just playing it to set the mood or as an intro or something, less likely to be fair use. Next up is the nature of the work. The song is a creative work, so this factor probably weighs against a fair use. Even if what you're doing is very newsy or public affairs-y or educational or something, because again, it's a creative work. It's less likely to be treated so favorably. All right, number 3, the amount and substantiality. Well, you're only using 10 seconds, but if it's the hook or the chorus, the most recognizable part of the song, well, that could be considered the heart or essence of the work, and that might weigh against fair use. So would someone listen to your podcast instead of buying? This is the 4th factor, effect on the market. Would someone listen to it instead of buying or streaming the song? If your use could replace the need for the original, then that will also weigh against a fair use. If you're only using 10 seconds, that's unlikely to be the case. But in this scenario, it's a fairly mixed balance of these 4 factors. So really, it's a toss-up. You might be better off using a piece of royalty-free music or licensing the music if you can, or getting a composer to create something for you. So now let's take a look at a few more real-world cases where fair use has been put to the test. Some of the recent cases in the last few years, Carreau versus Prince. In this case, the artist, who's known as an appropriation artist, it's his style, Richard Prince, used Patrick Carreau's photographs in a series of collages that he made. Prince's collages were, pieces of art that were put in exhibits and eventually in a book as well. The court found that Prince's work was transformative because it added new meaning. Even though it used significant chunks of Carreau's original photographs, the lesson here is that adding new expression or meaning to that original work can strengthen your claim of fair use, even if you are using a fairly substantial portion. In Seltzer versus Green Day, Inc., Green Day had used a street artist's work in a video montage during their concert tours. And the court said Green Day wins. They found that their use was transformative because it conveyed a differing message from that of the original work. For podcasters, what this highlights is the importance of ensuring that your use of copyrighted material is adding something new and distinct and something that we as a society essentially place value on. But then in 2023, the Supreme Court found against the Andy Warhol Foundation over its use of a photograph of the music icon Prince in their magazine cover on a memorial issue following that pop star's death. The court said that because the two works were fundamentally made for the same purpose, cover art for a publication, merely changing the background, the contrast, and the framing, as Warhol did, wasn't sufficiently transformative to change the meaning of the work. It's still a portrayal of the musician, any way you slice it. And then just last week, in the case of Hachette Book Group versus Internet Archive, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit upheld a ruling against the Internet Archive, finding that its book digitization and lending practices through something called the National Emergency Library, kind of the open library project, that use and lending had violated copyright law. The court rejected the archive's argument that it was protected under the fair use doctrine and emphasized that there was nothing transformative about scanning entire books without permission. Now, the court did acknowledge the archive is a nonprofit, and it reinforced the rights of authors and publishers, though, to control and profit from their works. This decision has significant implications for digital preservation efforts and ongoing debates about fair use, particularly in the context of emerging technologies like AI. So let's wrap up with some practical tips that'll help you navigate fair use in your podcasting. First off, always aim for transformation. Make sure that your use of copyrighted material is adding some new commentary, criticism, or meaning. This is your best defense in a fair use claim. Secondly, use only what you need. The less you use, the smaller the portion of the original that you use, the stronger will be your fair use claim. Avoid using the most recognizable or central parts of the original work if you can, especially if what you're doing isn't hypercritical kind of stuff. 3, consider the market impact. Ask yourself whether your use could substitute for the original work in the market. If it might, then you're likely outside the bounds of fair use. And finally, consult a lawyer. This is a nuanced area of law and lots of gray areas. When in doubt, talk to a lawyer who understands media and intellectual property law and has some experience doing fair use analysis. Understanding fair use is really crucial for podcasters who want to incorporate copyrighted material into their shows. Now, while fair use can offer some protection, it is not a free pass. If you carefully consider the 4 factors and look at these cases and follow some best practices, you can minimize your risk and keep your podcast on the right side of the law. But make no mistake about it. Relying on fair use, if you get sued, if you find yourself in the situation where you have to defend on this basis, you are in for a very costly fight. And, lawyers' fees and court costs and all that. And there's no rule of thumb, so it may very well turn out that your use is not considered fair use, and you'll be held liable for copyright infringement. Now, there is a resource I just want to tell you about. It's at U.S. Copyright Office Fair Use Index. It's copyright.gov/fair-use. I'll say that one more time. It's copyright.gov/fair-use. And what it is it's an index of all the fair use cases for the last, I think it's about 30 or 40 years worth, maybe more. So listen, if you found this episode helpful, I hope you'll check out podcastlawforms.com for all the legal templates and forms that you need to keep your podcast legally sound. And be sure to like, share, follow, subscribe, and all that good stuff. And until next time, I'm Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer.